For visitors drawn to Monte Palma's glittering shoreline, the first stop is often Costa de los Leones, the modern resort that promises luxury, leisure, and escape. Yet just beyond its gates, another story unfolds. Welcome to El Leoncito, the Little Lion, a boomtown that rose almost overnight in the shadow of the resort's success. At first glance, El Leoncito feels alive with local color. The main avenue hums with the calls of vendors, neon signs flash in every shade, and cantinas spill laughter into the street. Souvenir stalls overflow with trinkets stamped with Monte Palma's crest. For the unprepared traveler, it can look like a slice of authenticity, a chance to step beyond the polished promenades. But El Leoncito is not the Monte Palma of tradition. Built in the 1990s to capture tourist dollars, not to preserve heritage, it's a place hurried into being. Prices are inflated, the wares are mass-produced, and behind the carnival energy lies a town straining under its own promises. Stay on the main strip and you'll find a chaotic charm. Music pulsing from bars, street food sizzling on grills, the constant press of people. The restaurants and cantinas offer plenty of choice, but the cooking is often middling at best, with inflated tabs that play on the wallets of North American tourists. Step a block away, however, and the mood shifts. Paint fades, shutters close, and the streets grow quieter, edgier. By daylight, it's merely uninviting. After dark, even locals advise caution. El Leoncito is a place caught between ambition and decline. For tourists, it can be a memorable detour, and colorful, noisy, unforgettable, if approached with care. But at heart, it is less a reflection of Monte Palma's spirit than a mirror of the resort next door. Brash, opportunistic, and never quite what it seems.
Hello, and welcome back to Monte Palma. Sorry about the little bit of delay there in getting this episode out. The last couple of weeks have been rather hectic over here, and it just took a little longer to get this all put together. First thing I'm going to be doing here is just doing a few small alterations to the landscape, just enhancing the terrain a little bit, making it a little more visually interesting. We're going to try to go for a little bit of more of a cliffside look of some of these mountains. I had a bit of trouble with putting this episode together. My problem here was I didn't really have a clear idea in my head of what I wanted to build for the town just immediately adjacent to the resort area. I had this vague idea of it being of what it was, but not a clear plan or anything like that. And it was a bit of a struggle because initially, it just took quite a while to actually build out. I think I spent about 8 to 10 hours. building this, and yeah, by the end of it, it's not a huge area that I actually get built out in this episode. But it's really because I had no solid plan of what to build. The first few hours of the build, it was really a matter of just poking through the assets and plopping things down, trying things out. Eventually, the area started to come together. I did have the idea for it to have it as a fairly modern town. There probably was people living here before the resort was built, but everything we see built below us here is pretty much built once the resort was announced to be built on the coastline here. Everything else here built up around it, and it's all opportunistic investments trying to cash in on the huge influx in tourists that were going to be coming to this area. Like I said, I was trying out different assets. I put down some of the Mediterranean ones here and quickly realized that the style was just not going to work for this area. I want this all to be modern, but what that actually would look like. I didn't necessarily want it to be as expensive looking as the resort. This is like local investors trying to cash in on the tourist boom that was going to hit this area. What was going to be built here was going to be fairly generic, not particularly nice, quickly built tourist traps, 2-star hotels, all that sort of stuff. Trying to figure out what assets to use was challenging. There's not a lot of options yet in CS2, so it really was just going for all the assets, picking out stuff that I thought looked appropriate. I didn't want stuff with too much personality to it. I was trying to go for like quickly built urban sprawl. So it was a bit of a slog to get through this stuff. I wasn't particularly inspired to build it. Eventually it started to come together. It hit this tipping point where it finally started to take on some sort of identity that I can work with. Once I got to that point, it was better. But the initial stages of building out, like everything I'm putting down here, this was really a bit of a challenge. I know it doesn't look like it, but when you don't know what you're really building and then you're just trying to throw things out there, seeing if anything you put down actually makes any visual sense or makes sense for what you're, like the town you're trying to build. Yeah, it's just a long process. Eventually I get through it and we start to have a bit of a main street start to form here. This is going to be a little different looking than any of the other places I built so far. This was never built for the local people. This is all built because of tourism. It was built to try to cash in on the resorts. The idea I was going for here was, it's not exactly failed, but it's the kind of area that tourists who come to the resort and the coastline, they might venture out of the resort up the main street here, go a couple blocks, and then quickly realize that it just looks like the cities they come from at home. It's full of tacky tourist attractions, souvenir shops, overpriced bars and restaurants, and they quickly retreat back to the resort. The resorts have shuttle buses that will take them to the historic ports, Fort St. Sebastian, maybe even up to the convent. There's a lot of tourist attractions. They don't need to come here. Obviously, this area does have an economy that does feed off the tourist industry, so tourists do spend some time here, but I think it also paints a picture of what the tourists actually think of this area. The other challenge here is I didn't necessarily want to make this area super detailed. The resort is like my point of interest for this area, so this is essentially backdrop. What I plan to build out on the far side here, on the other coastline that's on the other side of the island, adjacent to this, is another focal point. Anyway, the whole thing took way too long, but it finally got done. I did spend quite a lot of time using the vanilla assets to try and asset packs as well, trying to splice buildings together in interesting ways, just to try to make something a little more unique looking. A lot of static ploppables were used here simply because of it's not a standard grid layout. Vanilla assets don't necessarily fit very well. Also, a lot of the stuff that come with the vanilla assets I didn't really want either. So there's a lot of static ploppables here, and I use the service blocks to give them some functionality. The other thing that was very challenging about this area is it's in this bowl in the valley here. And the elevations quickly crawl up the hillsides. And I did want to try to build stuff up into the hillside. Once again, this is where the vanilla assets are a bit of a hindrance because they want to flatten out the terrain, and they want to also include all these large yards and fences and all that sort of stuff, which is sometimes you just don't need that. The static ploppables are also really good for situations where you just want to build something that kind of feels like it conforms to terrain more than just alters it. For these residential areas up the hillside, they were a bit of a challenge. Now, there was some thought about the road network wanting to build in higher capacity roads, turn some of it into more structured highways. The idea being that with the resort development, infrastructure goes hand in hand with that. I had a bit of difficulty with that. Really, there isn't like these. I guess this might be the way I film the cinematics to make these places look a little larger than they actually are. They're not large areas and they don't have a huge population. And really, the glut of traffic is just everybody moving in. And once that's finished, the traffic calms down quite a bit. So I really didn't want to get into building actual highways quite yet. Also, if you're following the historic narrative that's going along with this, I think it's becoming fairly apparent now that this area or this whole entire country is somewhat corrupt. It would make sense to us that if you're building new resorts, new infrastructure would also be built at the same time, but that might not necessarily be true. I think a lot of things in this area get built with a lot of money flowing under the table, and there might have just not been money for infrastructure. That might come later, the late 80s, 1990s. And at this time, the corruption might be still pretty rampant. And so infrastructure projects for roads and all that sort of stuff might not exist. Obviously, we have, if it's the 1990s, for what's been built here is reflective of what was built during the 90s, we have another 30 years. And obviously, the government might have changed in that time. I haven't really, for current history for this place, put much thought into it yet. I'm still developing how this place gets to where it is and how the different points in time influence how the city is built. At this time, I'm going to go with the idea that corruption is still pretty obvious everywhere, and that has a huge influence on what gets built. I do have a lot of fun trying to figure out fun ways to add the assets that are unconventional. Like the grid system of City Skylines that's a grid. It's great if you're building North American cities, but for everywhere else, it can be a bit of a hindrance more than a help. So figuring out fun ways to mash buildings together, place them in the surrounding cityscape is I always have a lot of fun with it. It is a slow process though. You have to shuffle things around. You're cramming buildings into very tight spots and places, and it just takes time. That's all it really is. Kind of sucks if you're trying to get videos out on a weekly schedule, because sometimes this episode took quite a lot longer than I was expecting to put together for such a small area. But I think I had to hand place pretty much every building to get it to work. Also, like, zoning doesn't work for this because the zoning is fairly generic. Now, I know there are tricks you could do to tweak the zoning to get certain types of housing types to spawn together, but for this, really, to get a unique look, you really do have to hand place most of the buildings in order to achieve that. Problem with the static ploppables is they don't conform to terrain, so sometimes they end up floating. I've been using a lot of these surface flatteners to flatten things out before placing buildings. It really does help quite a bit. And because of all the odd building layouts and placements here, we have tons of these really awkward little spaces, and they are a perfect opportunity to add parking. One major issue of the way I'm constructing this area is there's very little parking, so I fit it in wherever I can. All these little odd, awkward spots, they're perfect to put in parking lots. They are custom, so that also takes a bit of time to put together, but I think once it's done, I think it looks much more organic. And right down here, I was trying to add some custom surfaces, and I really just didn't like the way this was turning out. So I ended up reconfiguring the road layout here, just deleting everything out and rebuilding it. These little service blocks are great. You can like sneak service buildings in pretty much anywhere. Right in this little area, I am putting in obviously a crematorium slash graveyard. I'm not sure exactly how it functions, death care. And right next door to it, we're putting in some road services as well. Which is great because I don't really have, for a lot of what I'm building here, I don't have a lot of space for those gigantic, these service industries take up huge amounts of area. And this is, I can squeeze them into a really tight spot and they service the community and blend in a little bit more. Like the crematorium is just a building I can't really use in this build. Maybe I can put it somewhere, but it doesn't really fit anywhere. And the road services building is gigantic. This is great, being able to do this. Now I do want to create my own custom billboards and signage and all that. I just have not had any time to get to it yet, but hopefully I'll be able to start doing that soon. Also, with the static ploppables, it allows me to sneak in a bit of industry where you usually wouldn't go. The great thing about the service blocks version of industry is, as far as I can tell, they don't produce any actual pollution, which is obviously a bit unrealistic, but there are quite a few industries that are fairly low. They don't necessarily produce huge amounts of pollution. They might be sweatshops or something like that. But yeah, they're a huge convenience where you have an urban environment where you don't want your industry necessarily producing huge amounts of pollution. Also, where a lot of industry goes into buildings that look like office buildings and stuff. So it also great for that. Now for the main street here, it's not very large. It's 2-3 blocks in length. It's really small. This is about as far as the tourists really ever go. They don't tend to go much beyond this street. But there isn't really anything to see beyond this, right? It's all pretty tacky commercial and stuff like that. So it's not of huge interest to the tourist industry. They are shocked by the overpriced drinks and bars and restaurants and all that, and then they leave. But there's a little bit of money thrown in here just to make this attractive for tourists. Believe it or not, I didn't think there was enough advertising. So I add a bit more, and I'll probably add even more yet at some point. In here I have this very steep bit of land which regular buildings will simply not work here. So I'm going to be using static ploppables once again, And we're going to be building a custom building in here. The way the static ploppables snap to the road, I can create this tiered effect where on the lower section we have them snapping to the lower road, and then on the upper section snap to the higher road. It didn't really quite work out that way, so we have to come in here and play around with it a little bit. It's a pretty hideous, ugly looking building when I'm done. I guess my thinking here is it's not like a part of the resort or anything, but it's like condos that are catering to the foreign retirees that kind of flock to the area who don't really have a huge amount of money to buy something expensive. So they buy one of these cheap condos near the beach is my thinking here. I'm using some of these giant cubes here to give it a foundation on the back end because it's floating. Then I realized that wasn't really going to be sufficient, so we're going to add another building here to give them entrances to the front end here. And it felt like I still needed a little more parking, so we're going to sneak in another parking garage here, a smaller one, and shuffle the buildings around a little bit, make it fit a little better. Here I'm just using the surface flattener to flatten the terrain a little bit. It helps with the static ploppables because they don't conform to terrain, so it just gives you more of a flat surface to place them on. I didn't really want to do a huge amount of detailing for this area, but I do have these large parking lots that just don't look right if I don't do something with them. So this is essentially where the bulk of the detailing is going to be, just on these particular areas, just to make them look a little more realistic than they do. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Over the next couple episodes, I think we're going to get into something quite a lot more interesting to build. It might be quite a bit of a challenge. I'm looking forward to it. And I will see everybody next week. Hopefully we're back to a more regular schedule after this point. Anyway, everybody take care, and I will see you next time. Bye.